The thunder of hooves echoed across the dusty Nevada plains as Victoria Harlow's captors dragged her mercilessly toward the waiting wagon. Blood trickled from her split lip, and tears streaked clean lines through the dust on her face. Three men, their faces shadowed beneath wide-brimmed hats, hauled her bound wrists with cruel efficiency while the fourth waited at the reins of the wagon, his rifle resting casually across his lap. "Please," Victoria begged, her voice hoarse from screaming. "My father will pay whatever you ask." "You don't have to do this." The largest of the men yanked her forward, causing her to stumble and fall to her knees on the hard, packed earth. "Your father had his chance to pay, Miss Harlow. Now Brennigan's gonna pay double for you, and you'll work off the rest in his saloon until your pretty face ain't worth nothing anymore." Victoria choked back a sob. Just yesterday, she had been helping her father in their dry goods store in Humboldt, Nevada. Now, in the early summer of 1875, she found herself being sold to the most notorious saloon owner in the territory. The men laughed as they hauled her to her feet again, continuing the cruel march toward the wagon that would take her to a life worse than death. "Almost there, boys," called the driver, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Get her loaded up quick. Don't like sitting out in the open like this." What happened next came so fast that Victoria could scarcely comprehend it. A single shot rang out from somewhere behind them, and the driver's head snapped back as he tumbled from the wagon seat, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The three men holding Victoria froze. Then, chaos erupted as they reached for their pistols. "Let the lady go," came a deep voice, calm and steady as stone. Victoria turned her head to see a lone figure astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. The sun silhouetted him dramatically, but she could make out a wide-brimmed hat and the glint of a silver star pinned to his leather vest. "This ain't your business, Daniels," snarled one of the men, keeping his grip on Victoria's arm while his other hand hovered near his holster. "I'm making it my business," the rider replied, his voice carrying across the distance without raising it. "Now cut those ropes and back away from Miss Harlow, or join your friend there in the dirt." The standoff lasted only seconds, though to Victoria it felt like hours. Then the man holding her laughed nervously. "3 against 1, lawman. Even you can't beat those odds." The mysterious rescuer nudged his horse forward, the rifle in his hand steady and sure. "I've faced worse. Try me if you're feeling lucky." What followed was a blur of motion and sound. One of the men drew his pistol, but before he could aim, a shot from the rider's rifle sent him sprawling backward. The other two opened fire simultaneously, causing Victoria to drop to the ground for cover. The rider Daniels, they had called him, dismounted in a fluid motion, rolling behind a boulder as bullets kicked up dust around him. 2 more shots from his position, and another of Victoria's captors cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. The last man standing grabbed Victoria roughly, pulling her up against him as a shield. "Back off, Daniels. I'll kill her, I swear it." Victoria felt the cold press of steel against her temple and closed her eyes, certain her last moments had come. "You won't get the chance," came the steady voice, now alarmingly close. Victoria's eyes flew open to see Daniels standing just feet away, having somehow circled behind them in the chaos. Before her captor could turn, the butt of Daniels' pistol came down hard on the man's head. His grip loosened, and Victoria stumbled forward as he crumpled to the ground. Strong hands caught her before she fell, and for the first time, Victoria looked directly into the face of her rescuer. Startling green eyes gazed back at her from a sun-weathered face, concern evident in the slight furrow of his brow. "Are you hurt, Miss Harlow?" he asked, already working to cut the ropes binding her wrists. "No," she managed, her voice trembling as the ropes fell away. "Just scared." "How do you know my name?" The man Daniels gave her a small smile that transformed his serious face. "Ethan Daniels, U.S. Marshal. Your father's been tearing apart the territory looking for you. When word reached me that the Watson gang was seen near Humboldt, I figured they might be involved in your disappearance." Victoria rubbed her raw wrists, still trying to process what had happened. "My father sent you." "Not directly," Marshal Daniels replied, guiding her gently toward his horse. "But the reward poster he put out caught my attention. 20 men from town have been searching the hills since yesterday." Victoria looked back at the men on the ground. One was clearly dead, the driver Daniels had shot first. The other 2 were wounded but alive, groaning and cursing as they clutched their injuries. "What will happen to them?" she asked. "They'll face a judge in Carson City," Daniels said, his voice hardening. "The Watson gang has terrorized this territory for too long. Kidnapping, robbery, worse." He paused, seeming to decide against elaborating further. "Can you ride, Miss Harlow? My horse can carry us both back to town." Victoria nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Marshal Daniels helped her onto his horse before securing the surviving kidnappers to their own mounts. He collected their weapons efficiently, then swung up behind Victoria. The solid warmth of his chest against her back made Victoria suddenly conscious of how improper their position was, but given the circumstances, propriety seemed the least of her concerns. She felt safe for the first time since being dragged from her father's store the previous evening. "Thank you," she said softly as they began the ride back to Humboldt. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." She felt rather than saw his nod. "Just doing my job, Miss Harlow." "Victoria," she corrected. "Please call me Victoria. After saving my life, I think you've earned that right." A moment of silence followed then. "Victoria, then, and you can call me Ethan." The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains as they rode, pulling the 2 bound prisoners behind them. Victoria found herself leaning back against Ethan's chest, her body giving in to exhaustion now that danger had passed. "Rest if you need to," he said, his voice rumbling through her. "You're safe now. We'll be back in town before nightfall." Victoria closed her eyes, letting the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves and Ethan Daniels' solid presence lull her into a state of security she'd thought she might never feel again. Humboldt was a small but prosperous mining town nestled in a valley of the Nevada high desert. As Ethan guided his horse down the main street with the 2 prisoners in tow, windows opened and people stepped out onto porches and boardwalks. Word of Victoria's kidnapping had spread quickly, and her return caused an immediate stir. "It's the Harlow girl," Marshal Daniels found her. "Someone fetch Mr. Harlow from the search party." The commotion grew as they approached the center of town. Victoria sat straighter, painfully aware of her disheveled appearance and the bruises she knew were forming on her face. "Sheriff's office first," Ethan said quietly. "We need to secure these men before the town decides to take justice into their own hands." Victoria nodded, understanding his concern. Even in a relatively civilized town like Humboldt, frontier justice could be swift and brutal when emotions ran high. Sheriff Morgan Thompson met them outside the jailhouse, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile when he saw Victoria. "Thank the Lord," he said, helping her down from the horse while his deputies moved to take custody of the prisoners. "Your father's been half mad with worry, Miss Harlow." "The Watson gang had her," Ethan explained, dismounting and handing the reins to a young deputy. "There was a 4th man, but he didn't make it. These 2 will need a doctor before they're fit for trial." Sheriff Thompson nodded grimly. "Doc Sullivan's in his office. I'll send for him." He turned to Victoria. "Are you hurt, child? Should we take you to the doctor as well?" "I'm fine," Victoria insisted, though her body ached from the rough handling and forced march. "I just want to see my father, Victoria." The shout came from down the street, and Victoria turned to see her father running toward her, his normally neat appearance disheveled from hours of searching. James Harlow was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes, now wide with relief and residual fear. "Father!" Victoria cried, rushing to meet him. James Harlow caught his daughter in a fierce embrace, holding her as if he feared she might vanish again. "My girl," he murmured into her hair. "My precious girl, when I came back from the bank and found the store ransacked and you gone." His voice broke. Victoria clung to him, tears flowing freely now. "I'm all right, father. Marshal Daniels saved me." James looked over his daughter's head at Ethan, who stood a respectful distance away. "Marshal," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you." Ethan touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. "No thanks necessary, Mr. Harlow, just doing what needed doing." "Please," James insisted, keeping one arm around his daughter, "come to our home. Whatever reward I offered is yours and more." Ethan shook his head. "The reward's not why I took the job, sir. But I would like to speak with you both once Miss Harlow has had a chance to rest. These men may not have been working alone." Sheriff Thompson stepped forward. "Marshal's right. The Watson gang usually runs 5 or 6 deep. If there are others out there, they might not take kindly to their plans being disrupted." A shadow of fear crossed James Harlow's face. "You think they might come back for Victoria?" "It's a possibility we need to consider," Ethan said gravely. "At least until we know more about why they targeted your daughter specifically." Victoria shuddered, remembering the kidnapper's words about someone named Brannigan paying for her. Her father tightened his arm around her protectively. "Then you'll stay with us, Marshal," James declared, in a tone that brooked no argument. "We have plenty of room, and I'd feel better knowing you were close by, at least until this matter is resolved." Ethan hesitated, looking from father to daughter. Victoria found herself hoping he would accept. Something about his steady presence made her feel secure in a way she couldn't quite explain. "Very well," Ethan finally agreed. "Let me help the sheriff secure these prisoners, and I'll join you shortly." As Victoria and her father walked toward their home at the edge of town, she couldn't help glancing back at the tall figure of Marshal Daniels. He stood conferring with Sheriff Thompson, his stance alert and watchful even in conversation. "He arrived yesterday," her father explained, noting her interest. "Asked a lot of questions about you and the store. Said he'd been tracking the Watson gang for months and had reason to believe they might be in the area." Victoria frowned. "Why would they target us? We're not wealthy by any means." Her father's expression darkened. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I intend to find out." Their home was a modest 2-story house behind the general store with a small garden that Victoria tended herself. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper who had helped raise Victoria after her mother's death 10 years prior, met them at the door with cries of relief and immediate fussing. "Look at you, child, bruised and filthy. What did those animals do to you?" She ushered Victoria inside, already calling for hot water to be brought up for a bath. Victoria allowed herself to be led upstairs, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion and delayed shock. As Mrs. Winters helped her out of her torn and dirty dress, Victoria caught sight of herself in the mirror. A stranger looked back at her, a wild-haired young woman with a swollen lip, a bruised cheek, and eyes that seemed older than her 22 years. "It's over now," Mrs. Winters said gently, seeing Victoria's expression. "You're home safe." Victoria nodded, but couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had started with her kidnapping was far from over. After a long soak in the copper tub, Victoria dressed in a simple blue cotton dress and brushed her long chestnut hair until it shone. She still felt shaky, but was determined to present a composed appearance when she faced Marshal Daniels again. When she descended the stairs, she found her father and the marshal seated in the parlor, deep in conversation that halted abruptly at her appearance. Ethan rose immediately, and Victoria was struck again by his imposing height and the quiet authority he carried without effort. He had removed his hat and gun belt, and his dark hair was slightly damp, suggesting he too had taken the opportunity to freshen up. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her, his green eyes taking in her transformed appearance. "You're looking much better." "Thank you, Marshal Daniels," she replied, taking a seat on the sofa opposite him. "I'm feeling more myself now." Her father cleared his throat. "The marshal has been sharing some disturbing information, Victoria. It seems your kidnapping wasn't random." Victoria's hands tightened in her lap. "I gathered as much. One of the men mentioned someone named Brannigan paying for me." Ethan nodded grimly. "Clayton Brannigan. He runs a string of saloons and brothels from Carson City to Elko. He's been trying to establish himself here in Humboldt, but your father and the town council have blocked his business license applications." "So this was revenge?" Victoria asked, feeling ill. "Partly," Ethan confirmed. "But Brannigan also has a reputation for acquiring attractive young women for his establishments by whatever means necessary." James Harlow's face flushed with anger. "That animal intended to force my daughter into prostitution to punish me for opposing his business interests." Ethan's expression was hard as flint. "That appears to be the case. Brannigan is careful to keep his own hands clean, working through men like the Watson gang. But I've been building a case against him for months. Your daughter's testimony could be the key to finally bringing him to justice." Victoria sat very still, processing this information. "You want me to testify against this man? In court?" "It would mean traveling to Carson City for the trial," Ethan acknowledged. "And possibly facing the men who kidnapped you again. I won't pretend it would be easy, Victoria." "She's been through enough," James protested. "Surely there must be another way." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Mr. Harlow, I understand your concern, but without Victoria's testimony, Brannigan will likely escape conviction again, as he has before. And he'll continue to terrorize communities and young women across Nevada." Victoria took a deep breath. "I'll do it," she said firmly, surprising herself with her resolve. "If my testimony can stop this man from hurting other women, then I have to try." Her father looked at her with a mixture of pride and worry. "Victoria, are you certain these are dangerous people?" "I'm certain," she replied, lifting her chin. "I won't let fear dictate my actions." Ethan's expression softened slightly, and Victoria caught a glimpse of admiration in his eyes. "Your courage is commendable, Miss Harlow, but Mr. Harlow is right about the danger. Until Brannigan is in custody, you'll need protection." "That's why you're staying with us," James stated. "Mrs. Winters has prepared the guest room for you." Victoria looked between the two men, realizing that Marshal Ethan Daniels would be living under the same roof as her for the foreseeable future. The prospect sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach that had nothing to do with fear. "When do you expect Brannigan to make his move?" she asked, forcing her thoughts back to the matter at hand. "Hard to say," Ethan replied, "but he doesn't strike me as a man who accepts failure easily. When he learns his men failed and 2 were captured, he'll either try again or attempt to eliminate the witnesses against him." Victoria shuddered despite herself. How reassuring! A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips. "My apologies, Miss Harlow. I believe in being forthright about the situations I face." "As do I, Marshal," she returned, meeting his gaze directly. "I appreciate your honesty, even if the truth is unpleasant." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Victoria was the first to look away, aware of her father's observant presence. "Well," James said, rising from his chair, "Mrs. Winters will have dinner ready soon. Marshal, please make yourself at home. Our house is your house for as long as you're in Humboldt." "Much obliged, sir," Ethan responded, standing as well. "And please, if we're to be sharing quarters, I'd prefer you call me Ethan." "Ethan, then," James agreed. "And I'm James. No need for formalities under these circumstances." As they moved toward the dining room, Victoria found herself walking beside Ethan, acutely aware of his presence. For a lawman who had undoubtedly faced countless dangerous situations, he moved with remarkable grace, each step measured and deliberate. "May I ask how long you've been a U.S. Marshal?" Victoria inquired, genuinely curious about the man who had saved her life. "5 years as a marshal," he replied. "Before that, I was with the Texas Rangers for 3 years, and before that, I rode with the Union cavalry during the war." Victoria did a quick calculation in her head. "You must have been very young during the war." A shadow crossed his face. 17 when I enlisted. Old enough to fight, too young to understand what I was fighting for." He paused. "Or against." Victoria sensed there was much more to that story, but dinner was being served and the conversation naturally shifted to more general topics. Throughout the meal, she found herself stealing glances at Ethan, intrigued by the contradictions. He embodied the hard-edged lawman with gentle manners, the gunfighter who quoted Shakespeare when Mrs. Winters mentioned her fondness for the theater. After dinner, as Mrs. Winters cleared the dishes, James excused himself to review the day's accounts from the store. Victoria rose to help with the cleaning, but Mrs. Winters shooed her away. "You've had quite enough excitement for one day, Miss Victoria. Go rest yourself in the parlor. Perhaps Marshal Daniels would enjoy some company." Victoria caught the knowing glint in the older woman's eye and felt a blush rising to her cheeks. Mrs. Winters had practically raised her after her mother died, and knew her better than anyone. The housekeeper had also made no secret of her opinion that, at 22, Victoria should be considering marriage rather than helping in her father's store. With no graceful way to refuse, Victoria returned to the parlor to find Ethan standing by the window, looking out at the darkening street with a vigilant gaze. "You expect trouble tonight?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. Ethan glanced down at her. "I don't expect it, but I never discount the possibility. It's how I've stayed alive this long." "It must be exhausting," Victoria observed, "always being on guard." "You get used to it," he replied with a slight shrug. "Eventually, it becomes second nature." Victoria studied his profile in the lamplight. Strong jaw, straight nose, eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Not conventionally handsome, perhaps, but striking in his intensity. "Have you always wanted to uphold the law?" she asked, genuinely interested in what drove this man. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "I've always believed in justice," he finally said. "Not always the law, but justice. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're not." "And when they're not," Victoria pressed. His eyes met hers, surprisingly candid. "Then a man has to decide which master he serves." "For me, it's justice, every time." Victoria nodded, understanding better now why he had pursued Brannigan so relentlessly. "Is that why you've devoted so much time to catching this man?" "Because justice demands it." "Partly," Ethan admitted. He seemed to debate whether to continue, then made his decision. "My younger sister was taken by men like Brannigan's. She was 19. I was away fighting in the war by the time I made it home and tracked her down." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "I was too late." She'd taken her own life rather than continue living as she was forced to. Victoria gasped softly, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I didn't mean to pry into painful memories." He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. "You didn't pry. And it was a long time ago. But men like Brannigan continue their evil work, and too often the law can't or won't stop them." "But you will," Victoria stated, not a question but a certainty. "Yes," he said simply. "I will." The intensity of the moment stretched between them, neither moving away. Victoria became acutely aware of how close they stood, how improper it would seem to anyone walking in. Yet she couldn't bring herself to step back. It was Ethan who finally broke the connection, moving slightly away to look back out the window. "You should get some rest, Victoria. Tomorrow we need to discuss safety precautions for you and your father." Victoria nodded, recognizing the dismissal but not offended by it. "Of course. Good night, Marshal Ethan." "Good night, Victoria," he replied softly. As she climbed the stairs to her bedroom, Victoria couldn't help but reflect on the complexity of the man now staying under their roof. Dangerous yet gentle, haunted yet determined. And despite the circumstances of their meeting, she found herself drawn to him in a way she had never experienced before. Sleep came surprisingly easily that night, perhaps because for the first time since her ordeal began, Victoria truly felt safe. The last thought before she drifted off was of steady green eyes and the promise they held not just of protection, but of something she couldn't yet name. The following week established a new routine in the Harlow household. Ethan proved to be an unobtrusive houseguest, often leaving early to coordinate with Sheriff Thompson or follow up on leads about Brannigan's operation. But he was always present at mealtimes and kept a watchful eye on the store when Victoria insisted on returning to work. "I can't hide away forever," she had argued when both her father and Ethan objected to her resuming her duties. "This is my life, and I won't let fear or Brannigan take it from me." Reluctantly, they had agreed, though Ethan established strict rules. Victoria was never to be alone in the store, never to walk unaccompanied even the short distance between the store and the house, and a loaded shotgun was kept within easy reach behind the counter. For her part, Victoria found herself watching Ethan when he thought no one was looking. The way he moved with fluid efficiency, the rare smiles that transformed his serious face, the gentleness he showed when helping misses. Winters carry heavy items or listening to James Harlow's stories of the early days of Humboldt. On the 7th day after her rescue, Victoria was arranging a new shipment of ribbons when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up with a welcoming smile that faltered when she saw Clayton Jeffries, the banker's son, swaggering in with his usual air of entitlement. "Miss Harlow," he greeted her with a tip of his hat. "How wonderful to see you recovered from your unfortunate experience." Victoria's smile thinned. Clayton had been pursuing her for months, undeterred by her polite but firm rejections. "Thank you, Mr. Jeffries. Was there something specific you needed today?" Clayton leaned against the counter, too close for comfort. "Just checking on your welfare. Father says your store loan payment is due next week. I'd be happy to discuss alternative arrangements if finances are tight." The implication was clear, and Victoria felt her temper rising. "Our finances are perfectly in order, Mr. Jeffries. And I believe your father prefers to handle business matters directly with mine." Clayton's smile didn't waver. "Of course. But you must admit, Victoria, that a woman alone is vulnerable in these times. Your recent trouble proves that. A husband with means and position would provide security that a shopkeeper's daughter otherwise lacks." Before Victoria could formulate a suitably scathing response, a shadow fell across the counter. She looked up to see Ethan standing behind Clayton, his expression cold. "Miss Harlow isn't alone, Mr. Jeffries," Ethan said quietly. "And I believe she's made her position clear regarding your propositions." Clayton straightened, turning to face Ethan with poorly disguised animosity. "Marshal Daniels, I didn't realize you'd appointed yourself Miss Harlow's personal guardian." U.S. Marshal Service takes witness protection very seriously, Ethan replied evenly. "Now, unless you have actual business here, I suggest you move along." Clayton's face flushed with anger, but he was smart enough to recognize the steel beneath Ethan's calm exterior. "Another time, perhaps," he said to Victoria, tipping his hat again before striding out of the store. When he was gone, Victoria let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you. Clayton Jeffries has been a thorn in my side for months." Ethan's expression softened slightly. "He seemed quite insistent. Has he bothered you before?" Victoria sighed, returning to her ribbon arrangement. "Clayton believes his father's position as town banker entitles him to whatever or whomever he wants. I've made it clear I'm not interested, but he's persistent." "Some men don't understand the word no," Ethan observed, helping her straighten a bolt of fabric that Clayton had carelessly displaced. "Most men, in my experience," Victoria replied wryly, "at least when it comes from a woman." Ethan paused, looking at her directly. "I hope I'm not included in that assessment." Victoria felt her cheeks warm under his gaze. "No," she said softly. "You're not most men, Ethan." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure at her words. Whatever it was, it vanished quickly as the door opened again, and James Harlow entered, carrying a stack of mail. "Letter from the circuit judge," he announced, handing an official-looking envelope to Ethan. "Express rider just delivered it." Ethan opened the letter, scanning its contents with a frown. "The trial's been set for 3 weeks from now in Carson City. Judge Harmon wants Victoria's deposition taken beforehand in case—" He hesitated. "In case Brannigan succeeds in silencing me before the trial," Victoria finished for him, appreciating his attempt to spare her but preferring honesty. Ethan nodded grimly. "Precisely. The judge is sending his clerk to Humboldt tomorrow to take your statement under oath." James Harlow set down the rest of the mail with a troubled expression. "This will make it official. Once her deposition is recorded, Brannigan will know for certain that Victoria can testify against him." "He likely already suspects it," Ethan pointed out. "But yes, this will confirm it. We'll need to be extra vigilant from tomorrow forward." Victoria straightened her shoulders, determined not to show the fear that fluttered in her stomach. "I won't back down. If giving my testimony helps put this man behind bars, then that's what I'll do." Ethan's gaze held a mixture of admiration and concern. "Your courage is commendable, Victoria, but courage alone won't stop a bullet. From now on, you don't go anywhere without me or your father at your side." The gravity of his words settled over the room. Victoria nodded her acceptance, recognizing that the danger was very real. Yet despite the threat hanging over her, she couldn't help but feel a small, inappropriate thrill at the prospect of spending more time in Ethan's company. The judge's clerk arrived the following day, a nervous young man named Edwin Powell, who had clearly never ventured far from Carson City before. He set up his materials in the Harlow parlor, carefully arranging ink, pen, and official papers while Victoria sat opposite him, Ethan standing vigilantly by the window. "Now, Miss Harlow," Powell began, adjusting his spectacles, "I'll need you to recount the events of your kidnapping in as much detail as possible. Take your time and try to recall every word spoken, particularly any mention of Mr. Brannigan or instructions that appeared to come from him." Victoria took a deep breath and began her account, starting with the moment 3 men had entered her father's store late in the afternoon. She described how they had claimed to be looking for mining supplies, then suddenly drawn weapons and forced her out the back door while the store was momentarily empty of other customers. "They mentioned Brannigan by name?" Powell asked, scribbling furiously. "Yes," Victoria confirmed. "The tallest one, I later heard the others call him Silas, said. Brannigan's paying good money for this one. Says she'll fetch top dollar with that face and figure." Powell's pen scratched across the paper. "And they specifically mention your father's opposition to Mr. Brannigan's business interests." Victoria nodded. "When I asked why they were doing this, the same man said, 'Your pa should have minded his own business instead of blocking Brannigan's saloon. Now he'll learn what happens to folks who cross the wrong man.'" As she continued her testimony, Victoria was aware of Ethan's presence, his attention focused intently on her words. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and she would find strength in his steady gaze to continue through the more difficult parts of her ordeal. When she described the moment of her rescue, Powell glanced up at Ethan with newfound respect. "You single-handedly confronted 4 armed men, Marshal Daniels." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I had the element of surprise, and only 3 were armed at the time." "Still," Powell said, clearly impressed, "that was extraordinary bravery." Victoria smiled slightly. "Marshal Daniels is being modest. He saved my life at considerable risk to his own." Ethan cleared his throat. "Miss Harlow's testimony is what matters here, not my actions." Powell nodded and returned to his questioning. By the time they finished, the afternoon had waned into evening, and Victoria felt emotionally drained from reliving the experience in such detail. "Thank you, Miss Harlow," Powell said, gathering his papers. "Your testimony is compelling and specific. If the judge deems it credible, and I have no doubt he will, it should be enough to issue warrants for the arrest of Clayton Brannigan and any remaining members of the Watson gang." After Powell departed, escorted to the hotel by Sheriff Thompson, Victoria remained in the parlor, staring into the fire that Mrs. Winters had lit against the evening chill. Ethan brought her a cup of tea and sat across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You did well today," he said quietly. Many witnesses falter when asked to recount traumatic events in such detail. Victoria sipped the hot tea gratefully. "I just told the truth. It wasn't pleasant to relive it, but if it helps put Brannigan away—" "It will," Ethan assured her. "Your testimony was clear and consistent." Juries respond to that. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Victoria asked the question that had been on her mind all day. "What happens after the trial? Will you move on to your next assignment?" Ethan looked into the fire, his profile strong in the flickering light. "That depends on the outcome. If Brannigan is convicted, yes, I'll likely be sent wherever I'm needed next." Victoria tried to ignore the disappointment that settled in her chest at his words. "Of course. I imagine the life of a U.S. Marshal doesn't allow for putting down roots in any one place." "It hasn't so far," he acknowledged, his gaze shifting to her face. "Though I've never had reason to consider it before." The implication in his words hung between them, unspoken but unmistakable. Victoria felt her heart quicken as their eyes held for a long moment. The spell was broken by Mrs. Winters bustling in to announce dinner. As they rose to join James in the dining room, Ethan lightly touched Victoria's elbow, a gesture of support that sent warmth spreading through her despite its brevity. Over the next few days, tension in Humboldt rose as word spread of Victoria's official deposition against Brannigan. Sheriff Thompson increased patrols around town, and several local men volunteered to keep watch at night, forming an impromptu citizens' guard. On the 4th night after Powell's visit, Victoria was awakened just past midnight by urgent voices downstairs. Pulling on a robe over her nightgown, she crept to the top of the stairs to listen. "Riding into town an hour ago," Sheriff Thompson was saying, his normally calm voice tense. My deputy spotted them at the south end. 5 men, heavily armed. Brannigan's men, came Ethan's voice, alert despite the late hour. Almost certainly. They checked into the Silverton Hotel under false names, but Jackson recognized 2 of them from wanted posters. They're known associates of Brannigan. Victoria's hand tightened on the banister. 5 men sent to silence her. The reality of the danger suddenly felt much more immediate. We need to move Victoria and her father somewhere safer, Ethan said decisively. They're too exposed here. Where do you suggest? Thompson asked. My jail's not secure enough against that many determined men, and there's no military outpost within 100 miles. There was a pause. Then Ethan spoke again, his voice lower. I have a place, a cabin in the hills about 15 miles west of here. It's remote, defensible, and known to very few people. Victoria leaned forward, straining to hear. How soon can you leave? Thompson asked. First light, Ethan replied. We'll need supplies. And I want to move under cover of darkness tomorrow evening, in case they're watching the roads out of town. I'll arrange for provisions to be ready before dawn, the sheriff promised. And I'll spread some false information about Victoria and her father taking the eastbound stage to throw them off your trail. Victoria had heard enough. She descended the stairs, making no effort to conceal her presence. Both men turned sharply at the sound of her footsteps, reaching instinctively for their weapons before recognizing her. Victoria, Ethan said, his expression softening slightly. You should be asleep. Difficult to sleep when men are planning my fate without consulting me, she replied, drawing her robe more tightly around herself as she joined them in the parlor. If we're leaving for a cabin in the hills, I should be packing, not sleeping. Sheriff Thompson had the grace to look abashed, but Ethan met her gaze directly. You're right. We should have included you in the discussion, but the danger is real and immediate, Victoria. Brannigan's men are in town, and they're not here for the scenery. I understand the danger, Victoria said firmly, and I'm not objecting to the plan. I just want to be treated as a participant in my own protection, not a package to be moved about. Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. We leave at first light. Pack only what's essential, a few changes of clothes. Anything of value you can't bear to leave behind. The cabin is small but secure, with provisions already stocked. My father, I'll wake him shortly, Ethan assured her. Sheriff Thompson will remain here in Humboldt to monitor Brannigan's men and maintain the impression that you're still in town as long as possible. Victoria turned to the sheriff. Be careful, Sheriff. These men sound dangerous. Thompson's weathered face creased in a smile. Don't you worry about me, Miss Harlow. I've been dealing with troublemakers in this territory since before you were born. After the sheriff departed, Victoria stood in the parlor with Ethan, acutely aware of her state of undress despite the modest robe that covered her nightgown. This cabin of yours, she began, seeking to dispel the sudden awkwardness. Is it somewhere you go often? Ethan shook his head. Not often. It's more of a refuge for emergencies like this, somewhere I can go to ground when needed. And few people know about it. Very few, he confirmed. Which is why it should be safe for you and your father. Victoria nodded, then asked the question that had been forming in her mind since overhearing their conversation. And after we reach this cabin, what then? Do we simply hide until the trial? Ethan's expression turned grim. Ideally, yes. But if Brannigan's men are already in Humboldt, they won't give up easily. They'll search for you, and eventually they might find the cabin's location. When that happens, we need to be prepared. Prepared to fight, you mean, Victoria clarified, a chill running through her despite the warmth of the room. I hope it doesn't come to that, Ethan said quietly. But yes, We need to be prepared for that possibility. Victoria straightened her shoulders. Then you should know I can shoot. My father taught me when I was 16. I'm not expert with a pistol, but I'm competent with a rifle. Surprise flickered across Ethan's face, followed by what might have been approval. That's good to know. Most women I've encountered haven't had such training. My father believed a woman on the frontier should be able to defend herself, Victoria explained. Especially after my mother died. He said he might not always be around to protect me. Ethan's gaze softened. Your father is a wise man. He glanced toward the stairs. I should wake him now. We have much to prepare before dawn. As Victoria turned to go back upstairs, Ethan spoke again. Victoria, she paused, looking back at him. I promise you I won't let any harm come to you or your father, whatever it takes. The intensity in his voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with fear. I believe you, Ethan. Good night. Good night, Victoria. As she climbed the stairs, Victoria couldn't help but wonder what the coming days would bring. Hiding in a remote cabin with Ethan Daniels would mean close quarters and constant proximity, a prospect that both thrilled and terrified her for reasons that had little to do with the threat of Brannigan's men. Dawn broke cold and misty over Humboldt as Victoria, her father, and Ethan loaded supplies into a nondescript wagon. They worked quietly, trying not to draw attention to their preparations. Mrs. Winters hugged Victoria tightly before they departed, pressing a package of freshly baked bread into her hands. You be careful, child, the older woman whispered. And keep an eye on that Marshal of yours. He looks at you like a man dying of thirst looks at water. Victoria blushed furiously. He's not my Marshal, Mrs. Winters. The housekeeper merely patted her cheek with a knowing smile. If you say so, dear. Just remember what I taught you about men. They need a firm hand and a gentle heart. Victoria climbed into the wagon beside her father, her face still warm as Ethan took the reins. They set out on the main road heading east the opposite direction from their actual destination, in case anyone was watching. Sheriff Thompson had arranged for one of his deputies to meet them at a crossroads 5 miles out of town, where they would switch to horses and head into the hills. The journey was tense, with Ethan constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of pursuit. At the arranged meeting point, Deputy Collins was waiting with 3 saddled horses and a pack horse for their supplies. Any sign of trouble? Ethan asked as they quickly transferred their belongings. Collins shook his head. Road's been quiet all morning. Sheriff says Brannigan's men are still at the hotel, though 2 of them were asking questions at the stage office about eastbound departures. Good, Ethan said. That means our diversion is working. Head back to town now, and remember if anyone asks. You were patrolling the eastern road and saw nothing unusual. The deputy nodded and mounted his horse, turning back toward Humboldt while Ethan helped Victoria into her saddle. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they headed west into the hills, following game trails and dried creek beds that showed little sign of human passage. By midday, they had climbed high enough that Victoria could look back and see the town of Humboldt in the distance, a small cluster of buildings nestled in the valley below. The air was cooler at this elevation, and pine trees began to replace the scrub brush of the lower slopes. James Harlow, who had been mostly silent during their journey, finally spoke. How much farther to this cabin of yours, Marshal? Another 3 hours at this pace, Ethan replied, guiding his horse around a rocky outcropping. We'll reach it before sunset. Victoria observed her father with concern. At 53, James was still strong and capable, but the strain of recent events was evident in the new lines around his eyes and the way he sat slightly hunched in his saddle. We can rest a while if you need to, father, she suggested gently. James straightened, as if caught in a moment of weakness. "I'm fine, Victoria. Just thinking about the store. I hope Thompson remembers to check the roof for leaks if it rains. That back corner has been trouble since last winter." Victoria exchanged a glance with Ethan, both recognizing James's attempt to maintain normalcy in an extraordinary situation. "I'm sure he will, Father, and Mrs. Winters won't let him forget." They continued their journey in companionable silence, stopping occasionally to rest the horses and eat some of Mrs. Winters' bread with dried beef. The landscape grew wilder and more beautiful as they climbed, with expansive views of the Nevada high country spreading out around them. Late in the afternoon, they descended into a small, sheltered valley nestled between two ridges. A clear stream ran through it, and near the far end, partially hidden by a stand of tall pines, stood a sturdy log cabin. "There it is," Ethan said, pointing. "Home, at least for the time being." Victoria studied the cabin as they approached. It was larger than she had expected, with a stone chimney and a covered porch across the front. The location was perfect for a hideaway difficult to find unless you knew exactly where to look, yet with good visibility of the surrounding area. "It's lovely," she said, surprised by the rustic charm of the place. "Have you owned it long?" "5 years," Ethan replied, dismounting and coming to help her down from her horse. "Bought it from an old trapper who was heading back east. I've added to it over time when I could." His hands settled at her waist as he lifted her effortlessly from the saddle. For a moment, they stood close enough that Victoria could feel the warmth of his breath, see the flecks of gold in his green eyes. Then he stepped back, turning to help her father dismount as well. The interior of the cabin was simple but comfortable, with a large main room containing a stone fireplace, a solid wooden table with chairs, and several well-made pieces of furniture including a rocking chair and a small sofa covered with a woven blanket. A curtain separated this area from what appeared to be a sleeping area at the back. "It's not fancy," Ethan said, watching Victoria's inspection, "but it's secure. The walls are double-thick logs and there's only one door and 2 windows, both with sturdy shutters. A man would have a hard time forcing his way in if we don't want him to." James nodded approvingly. "You chose well, Marshal. Defensible position, water source nearby, hidden from casual observation. There's a small bedroom through that curtain," Ethan continued, gesturing. "Victoria can take that. Mr. Harlow, you can use the bed in the loft area up those stairs. I'll sleep down here by the fire." Victoria felt a pang of guilt at taking the most comfortable sleeping arrangement. "I don't mind the loft if Father would prefer the bedroom." James shook his head firmly. "Nonsense, Victoria. A lady needs her privacy. The loft will suit me fine." As they unpacked their supplies and settled into the cabin, Victoria found herself watching Ethan moving about the space. He seemed different here, more relaxed, as if the weight of his badge and responsibility eased slightly within these walls. He built a fire with practiced efficiency, checked and rechecked the security of the windows and door, and began preparing a simple meal from their provisions. "You seem at home here," Victoria observed, joining him at the small counter area where he was slicing dried meat and potatoes into a pot. "I suppose I am," he replied, his hands never pausing in their work. "This is the closest thing to a home I've had since before the war." "Yet you rarely visit," Ethan glanced at her. "The life I've chosen doesn't allow for much time in one place, and a solitary cabin in the mountains isn't much use to a man alone." There was something in his voice, a hint of loneliness, perhaps, that made Victoria's heart ache. She wanted to say more, to ask about the life he envisioned beyond chasing criminals, but her father joined them then, and the moment passed. After a satisfying meal of stew and the last of Mrs. Winters' bread, they sat around the fire as darkness settled over the valley. James, exhausted from the journey, soon excused himself to the loft, leaving Victoria and Ethan alone in the flickering firelight. "How long do you think we'll need to stay here?" Victoria asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Ethan poked at the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Hard to say. The trial begins in just over 2 weeks. Ideally, we'd remain here until then, traveling to Carson City only when necessary." Victoria nodded, watching the play of light and shadow across his features. "And if Brannigan's men find us before then, they won't find it easy to reach us," Ethan assured her. "There's only one clear approach to the cabin, and I've set up signals that will alert us if anyone comes up the trail, if they do manage it." He paused. "Well, they'll find I'm not easily surprised." Victoria believed him. In the days she had known him, she had observed Ethan's constant vigilance, his awareness of his surroundings that seemed almost instinctive. It was a quality that had undoubtedly kept him alive through years of dangerous work. "Have you ever thought about what you might do when this is all over?" she asked, voicing the question that had been on her mind earlier. "After Brannigan is brought to justice." Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I've been chasing justice for so long," he finally said, his voice low, "that I'm not sure I know how to do anything else. But lately—" He looked up, meeting her eyes. "Lately, I've been wondering if there might be more to life than hunting down the next outlaw." Victoria's breath caught at the intensity in his gaze. "What kind of more have you been considering?" Before he could answer, a sound outside the cabin made them both freeze, the snap of a twig, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his hand going to the pistol at his hip. "Stay down," he whispered, moving silently to the window and peering out through a small gap in the shutters. Victoria's heart pounded as she crouched lower in her chair. Had Brannigan's men found them already? It seemed impossible they could have been tracked so quickly. After a tense minute, Ethan's shoulders relaxed slightly. "A deer," he said, turning back to her with a reassuring smile. "Just a curious buck checking out his new neighbors." Victoria let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her racing heart. "You're certain?" "I can see him clearly in the moonlight," Ethan confirmed. "But this is a good reminder that we need to be vigilant even here." The moment of intimacy that had been building between them was broken, replaced by the stark reality of their situation. Victoria rose from her chair, suddenly aware of how late it had grown. "I should get some rest," she said. "It's been a long day." Ethan nodded, though something in his eyes suggested he was reluctant to end their conversation. "Of course. Sleep well, Victoria. I'll keep watch for a while longer." "Good night, Ethan," she said softly, hesitating at the curtain that separated her bedroom from the main room. "And thank you for everything you're doing to protect us." His smile in the firelight made her heart skip. "No thanks necessary. Get some rest now." As Victoria prepared for bed in the small but comfortable bedroom, she found herself reflecting on the strange turn her life had taken. Just over a week ago, she had been a shopkeeper's daughter with a predictable existence in a small Nevada town. Now she was in hiding, a key witness against a dangerous criminal, and most surprising of all, developing feelings for a U.S. Marshal with haunted eyes and gentle hands. She fell asleep to the comforting sounds of Ethan moving quietly about the cabin, securing their sanctuary against the dangers that might lurk in the darkness beyond. The days at the cabin settled into a rhythm that was both strange and comforting. Mornings began early, with Ethan often already awake and checking the perimeter when Victoria emerged from her room. They shared simple meals prepared from their provisions, supplemented by fresh trout that Ethan caught in the nearby stream and wild berries that Victoria gathered from bushes surrounding the clearing. James Harlow, after his initial restlessness, seemed to embrace the forced respite from the store. He spent hours reading books that Ethan had accumulated on the cabin's small shelf, occasionally stepping outside to sit in the sunshine and sketch the landscape with pencil and paper that Victoria had thoughtfully packed. On the third day, as Victoria was washing dishes from their midday meal, Ethan approached her with a determined expression. "I'd like to see how well you handle a rifle," he said without preamble. "If Brannigan's men do find us, I need to know what you're capable of." Victoria dried her hands on a cloth, meeting his gaze steadily. "Now," he nodded, "your father's resting and the afternoon is clear. We can set up some targets at the far end of the meadow." They walked together to a flat area about 100 yards from the cabin. Ethan carried 2 rifles, his own Winchester, and a slightly smaller Remington that he handed to Victoria. "This has less kick than the Winchester," he explained. "Good for accuracy without wearing you out." Victoria took the rifle with confidence, checking the chamber and sighting mechanism as her father had taught her years ago. Ethan watched her hands move over the weapon with obvious approval. "You've handled firearms before," he observed. "I told you my father taught me," she reminded him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Did you think I was exaggerating?" "Not exaggerating," he clarified. "But there's a difference between being shown how to shoot and truly knowing a weapon." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Set up your targets, Marshal Daniels, and I'll show you what I know." Ethan's mouth quirked in amusement as he placed several empty cans and bottles at varying distances along a fallen log. Then he stepped back, gesturing for Victoria to proceed. She took her position, lifted the rifle to her shoulder and took careful aim at the nearest target. The Remington cracked sharply and the can flew off the log. Without pausing, she shifted her aim to the next target, then the next, until 5 of the 7 objects had been hit. Lowering the rifle, she turned to find Ethan watching her with undisguised admiration. "Impressive," he said. "Your father taught you well." "He said I had a natural eye for it," Victoria replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. "Though I missed 2. The farthest ones," Ethan noted. "That's more about practice than ability. A few adjustments to your stance would help with the distance shots." He moved behind her as she raised the rifle again, his hands gently correcting the position of her elbows and shoulders. Victoria was acutely aware of his proximity, the solid warmth of his chest just inches from her back, his breath stirring the loose strands of hair near her ear. "Like this," he murmured, his voice low. "Keep your left elbow dropped slightly. It steadies the barrel for the longer shots." Victoria tried to focus on his instructions rather than the flutter in her stomach at his nearness. She sighted down the barrel at one of the remaining targets, adjusted as he had shown her, and squeezed the trigger. The bottle exploded in a satisfying spray of glass. "Perfect," Ethan said, his hands lingering on her shoulders a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. They spent another hour practicing, with Ethan offering occasional guidance that improved Victoria's already solid marksmanship. By the time they returned to the cabin, she felt more confident in her ability to defend herself if the need arose. James was awake and sitting on the porch, his sketchbook open on his lap. He looked up as they approached, smiling at the rifle Victoria carried. "I heard the shooting. How did she do?" "Your daughter is quite the marksman, Mr. Harlow," Ethan replied, a note of respect in his voice that made Victoria stand a little straighter. "With a bit more practice, she could outshoot most men I know." James nodded, unsurprised. "Victoria has always been a quick study, whether it's bookkeeping, bargaining with suppliers, or shooting. Her mother was the same way capable of anything she set her mind to." Victoria felt a warm glow at the comparison to the mother she still missed dearly. I had good teachers, she said, glancing from her father to Ethan. That evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, the conversation turned to their eventual journey to Carson City for the trial. Ethan spread out a map on the table, tracing potential routes with his finger. The most direct path would take us through Devil's Canyon, he explained, indicating a narrow passage between two mountain ranges. But it's too easily ambushed. I'm thinking we take the longer route here, along the old mining trail. It adds half a day to the journey but offers better visibility and more escape routes if we run into trouble. James leaned over the map, studying it carefully. What about crossing at Fenton's Bridge? That would cut some time off the northern route. Ethan shook his head. Bridge was washed out in the spring floods. Won't be rebuilt until next year. As the men continued discussing logistics, Victoria found her attention drawn to Ethan's hands moving across the map, strong, capable hands that had saved her life, guided her aim with a rifle, and occasionally, when he thought no one was looking, sketched remarkably good likenesses of landscapes in a small journal he kept in his saddlebag. She had discovered this hidden talent 2 days earlier, when curiosity had prompted her to peek at the journal he had left on the porch. The pages held not only detailed maps and notes about various territories, but also beautiful drawings of mountains, rivers, and occasionally people's faces captured with surprising sensitivity by a man who presented such a hard exterior to the world. Victoria hadn't mentioned her discovery, sensing it was a private pursuit he might be embarrassed to have revealed. But the knowledge had added another layer to her understanding of Ethan Daniels' lawman, protector, and secret artist. Victoria. Her father's voice brought her back to the present. What do you think? She blinked, realizing she had missed part of the conversation. I'm sorry, what was the question? James smiled knowingly. Ethan suggested we might want to consider staying in Carson City for some time after the trial, in case Brannigan has associates who might seek revenge if he's convicted. I said we should return to Humboldt as soon as possible to reopen the store. Victoria considered the options. The store was their livelihood and their connection to the community they had helped build, but her father's safety came first. Perhaps a compromise, she suggested. We could return to Humboldt but arrange for additional security at the store and house for a while. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. That's sensible. I could speak with the territorial governor about assigning a deputy marshal to Humboldt temporarily. Would you not be returning with us? Victoria asked, unable to keep a note of disappointment from her voice. Ethan's eyes met hers across the table. That would depend on my next assignment, but I could certainly make the recommendation. The thought of Ethan leaving once the trial was over had been hovering in the back of Victoria's mind for days, but hearing it spoken aloud made it suddenly, painfully real. She had grown accustomed to his presence, to the sense of security he provided, and to something more, a connection that deepened with each passing day. Well, James said, folding the map, that's a bridge we'll cross when we come to it. For now, I think I'll turn in. These mountain nights make an old man sleepy. As James climbed the stairs to the loft, Victoria remained at the table, tracing the lines of the map with her fingertip. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. You've been very brave through all of this, he said quietly. Many people would have fallen apart after what you've endured. Victoria looked up at him. I don't feel brave. Most of the time I'm terrified. I just try not to show it. That's what courage is, Ethan replied. Not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Victoria smiled wryly. Is that what you do? Act despite your fear. Every day, he admitted, surprising her with his candor. Fear keeps you alive in my line of work. It's when you stop feeling it that you make mistakes. What are you afraid of, Ethan Daniels? Victoria asked softly, genuinely curious about what could frighten this seemingly fearless man. He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Then, his voice low and measured. "I'm afraid of failing those who depend on me. Of not being fast enough or smart enough when it matters most." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected vulnerability. "And lately, I've been afraid of what happens after this is all over." Victoria's breath caught. "What do you mean?" Ethan leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "For years, my life has had a clear purpose: find the next criminal, bring them to justice, move on to the next assignment. It's been simple in its way. Lonely but simple." He hesitated. "But meeting you, it's made me question whether that's enough anymore." The air between them seemed charged with possibility. Victoria's heart thundered in her chest as she gathered her courage. "And what have you concluded?" Before he could answer, a distinctive sound from outside the cabin made them both freeze, the sharp whistle of a bird that shouldn't be calling at night. Ethan was on his feet instantly, his hand going to his pistol. "That's one of my signals," he whispered, moving to extinguish the lamp on the table, leaving only the dim glow from the fireplace. "Someone's on the trail." Victoria's blood turned cold. "Brannigan's men." "Or someone who's lost their way," Ethan replied, though his expression suggested he didn't believe it. "Stay here. Keep your rifle close, but don't shoot unless I give the signal." He moved silently to the window, peering out into the darkness. Victoria retrieved the Remington from its place near the door, her hand steady despite her racing heart. She watched as Ethan checked his pistol, then took his rifle from its rack by the door. "Wake your father," he instructed softly. "Tell him to stay in the loft and keep watch from the upper window. I'm going out to circle around and see who our visitors are." "Ethan," Victoria whispered urgently as he prepared to slip through the door. "Be careful." He looked back at her, a ghost of a smile crossing his features. "Always am." Then he was gone, a shadow melting into the darkness outside. Victoria hurried to the loft ladder, climbing quietly to wake her father. James was alert immediately, reaching for his own pistol as she explained the situation. He took up position at the small window in the loft that overlooked the approach to the cabin, while Victoria returned to the main room, her rifle ready as she positioned herself where she could see both the door and the main window. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as she waited, straining to hear any sound from outside. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, leaving the cabin in near darkness, good for concealment, but making it difficult to see if anyone approached. When the door finally opened, Victoria nearly fired before recognizing Ethan's silhouette. He slipped inside, securing the door behind him before speaking. "3 riders," he reported in a low voice. "They've made camp about half a mile down the valley. They're trying to be stealthy, but they're not woodsmen. I got close enough to hear them talking." "Brannigan's men?" Victoria asked, already knowing the answer. Ethan nodded grimly. "They mentioned your name and the reward Brannigan's offering. They're not certain we're up here, but they're searching the likely hideouts in the area." James descended from the loft, his expression troubled. "How did they find this valley? I thought you said few people knew about this place." "They're working a grid search pattern," Ethan explained, checking every possible location within a certain radius of Humboldt. "They got lucky finding this valley, but they don't know about the cabin yet. It's well hidden from the main trail." "What do we do?" Victoria asked, keeping her voice calm despite the fear churning in her stomach. Ethan considered for a moment. "We have 2 options. We can try to slip away before dawn, taking a route they won't expect, or we can stay put and hope they move on without discovering us." "If we run, we risk being caught in the open," James observed. "But if we stay and they find the cabin, we'll be cornered," Ethan finished, "but with the defensive advantage." Victoria looked between them, then made her decision. I won't run anymore. They turn me into prey once. I won't let them do it again. If they find us, we'll be ready for them. Ethan's eyes met hers, and she saw something like pride in his gaze. Then we prepare for a fight and hope it doesn't come to that. First light is in 5 hours. That's when they're likely to resume their search. The next few hours passed in tense preparation. Ethan checked and rechecked their weapons, positioned furniture to provide cover if shooting started, and cached extra ammunition at strategic points around the cabin. Victoria and James filled every available container with water and moved food supplies to accessible locations. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Ethan gathered them for final instructions. I'll be outside, keeping watch from the rocks above the cabin. I have the best chance of spotting them before they see us. Mr. Harlow, you take the loft position again. It gives you a good angle on the approach trail. Victoria, stay on the main floor away from the windows but where you can cover the door. He hesitated, then added, if shooting starts, don't expose yourself unnecessarily. One clean shot is worth more than 10 hasty ones. And if something happens to me, there's a hidden exit through the root cellar. The trapdoor is under the rug by the fireplace. It leads to a tunnel that comes out behind the ridge. Victoria wanted to protest, to insist that nothing would happen to him, but she nodded instead, understanding the necessity of his precautions. We'll be ready. As Ethan prepared to leave, he paused beside Victoria, his expression intense. About last night, what I started to say before we were interrupted. It can wait, Victoria said softly, though everything in her wanted to hear his words. Until after. Ethan nodded, his hand briefly touching hers. Until after, he agreed. Then he was gone, slipping out into the gray light of early morning. The wait that followed was excruciating. Victoria positioned herself as Ethan had instructed, the Remington across her lap as she sat in a chair angled to give her a clear view of the door while keeping her hidden from the windows. Above her, she could hear her father's occasional movement as he maintained his vigil from the loft. The sun had fully risen, painting the cabin with golden light through the cracks in the shutters, when a bird call sounded from outside, 3 short whistles followed by a longer one. Ethan's signal that someone was approaching. Victoria's grip tightened on her rifle. She looked up at the loft opening where her father nodded to indicate he had heard it too. They waited, every sense alert for further signs. Minutes passed. Then came the sound of voices, distant at first, then growing clearer as they approached the cabin. Men's voices, rough with fatigue and frustration. Wasting our time up here. Probably halfway to California by now. Brennigan said to check every cabin and mine shaft in these hills. You want to tell him we got tired and gave up? I'm just saying, 3 days of riding and nothing to show for it. Victoria held her breath as the voices drew nearer. They had found the cabin. Now everything depended on whether Ethan could remain hidden and what the men intended to do. A heavy knock rattled the cabin door. Hello, the house. Anybody home? Victoria remained motionless, her finger resting lightly beside the trigger of her rifle. The men waited a moment, then knocked again, harder. Looks abandoned, one of them said. But there's a woodpile round back that ain't old. Someone's been here recently. Try the door, another voice commanded. The latch rattled as someone tested it, finding it locked. Locked from inside, the man reported. Want me to break it down? There was a pause then. No. Circle around first, check the windows. Could be a trapper's cabin. No sense making enemies if we don't need to. Victoria heard footsteps moving around the exterior of the cabin, pausing at each window to peer through gaps in the shutters. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows of her position, praying they wouldn't spot her or her father in the loft. Can't see much. one of the men reported as they completed their circuit. Place looks lived in, though. Fresh ashes in the fireplace, visible through the chimney. "Break it down," came the command. Victoria steeled herself, raising her rifle to her shoulder as the first impact shook the heavy door. It held firm. Ethan had reinforced it well, but she knew it wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. The men outside seemed to reach the same conclusion. "This ain't no ordinary cabin door," one observed. "Somebody doesn't want visitors." "Or they're hiding something or someone," replied another voice. "Jenkins, get the axe from the pack horse." Victoria's mind raced. Where was Ethan? Why hadn't he made his move yet? She glanced up at the loft opening, meeting her father's concerned gaze. He gestured slightly with his pistol, asking without words if they should open fire now. Victoria shook her head minutely. Ethan had a plan. They needed to trust him. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the men's efforts, a horse coming fast up the trail toward the cabin. Victoria's heart leapt. "Ethan, rider coming," one of the men shouted. Victoria heard the metallic click of weapons being drawn, followed by a voice she recognized as Sheriff Thompson's. "Morning, gentlemen. Fine day for a ride in the mountains, isn't it?" There was a moment of confused silence then. "Who the hell are you?" "Sheriff Morgan Thompson, Humboldt County," came the calm reply. "And you boys are a long way from anywhere. Mind if I ask what brings you up to these parts?" Victoria could hardly believe her ears. Sheriff Thompson here? How had he known where to find them? "Just looking for a friend of ours," one of the men replied, his tone cautious. "Heard he might be staying at a cabin up this way." "Friend got a name?" Thompson asked. "Harlow. James Harlow and his daughter." The sheriff's laugh seemed genuine. "Well, you boys are on a wild goose chase then." "The Harlows left Humboldt 3 days ago on the eastbound stage, heading for relatives in Denver, from what I heard." The silence that followed was tense with suspicion. "You seem mighty certain of that, Sheriff," one of the men finally said, "and mighty interested in our business." "It's my job to know who's coming and going in my county," Thompson replied evenly. "Just like it's my job to investigate when strangers start poking around abandoned cabins with drawn weapons." Victoria heard the subtle shift of boots on dirt as the men repositioned themselves. The confrontation was balanced on a knife's edge. "Now," Thompson continued, his voice hardening slightly, "I suggest you boys move along. This cabin belongs to a friend of mine who doesn't take kindly to trespassers." "And if we're not inclined to leave just yet?" challenged one of the men. What happened next was so fast that Victoria barely registered the sequence of events. A shot rang out from somewhere above the cabin, Ethan's position, in the rocks striking the ground at the feet of the men. Simultaneously, Sheriff Thompson's voice rang out. "That would be a grave mistake, gentlemen. You're surrounded." Victoria risked a glance through a crack in the shutters. Sheriff Thompson sat astride his horse, his shotgun leveled at the 3 men who stood with their backs to the cabin. From her limited view, she could see they were ordinary-looking cowboys, though heavily armed and now clearly nervous as they glanced at the hills around them. "Marshal Daniels has a rifle trained on you from those rocks," Thompson continued calmly. "And I assure you he rarely misses. There are also 2 deputies positioned in the trees to your left. Now, I'm going to ask you once more to lower your weapons and state your real business here." The tension stretched for several heartbeats. Then, reluctantly, the men holstered their pistols. "Brennigan sent us to find the Harlow girl," admitted the apparent leader of the group. "Said she was going to cause him trouble in court." "And what were you supposed to do when you found her?" Thompson pressed. The man shifted uncomfortably. "Just persuade her that testifying wouldn't be in her best interest." "With those?" Thompson nodded toward their weapons. None of the men answered, their silence damning. "Here's what's going to happen," Thompson said, his voice carrying clearly to Victoria inside the cabin. "You're going to mount up and ride back to wherever Brannigan is hiding. You'll tell him that Victoria Harlow is under the protection of the U.S. Marshal Service and the full authority of the territorial court. Any further attempts to intimidate or harm her will result in additional charges against him and anyone carrying out his orders. Is that clear?" The men exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, the leader nodded. "Clear enough, but Brannigan won't be happy." "Brannigan's happiness is not my concern," Thompson replied coldly. "Now mount up. My deputies will escort you to the county line." Victoria watched through the crack as the men grudgingly returned to their horses, which were tethered a short distance away. As they prepared to depart, Ethan appeared from the rocks, his rifle still trained on the group. "One more thing," he called down to them. "Tell Brannigan that Marshal Daniels sends his regards, and that the next time he sends men after Victoria Harlow, I won't be giving warnings." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. The men mounted quickly, casting wary glances at Ethan as they turned their horses back down the trail. Two riders that Victoria hadn't seen before the supposed deputies Thompson had mentioned fell in behind them. Only when the sounds of hoofbeats had faded into the distance did Victoria dare to move from her position. She unlocked the cabin door with trembling hands and stepped onto the porch, where Ethan and Sheriff Thompson were now conversing in low voices. Both men turned as she appeared, relief evident on their faces. "Victoria," Ethan said, quickly closing the distance between them. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she assured him, though her voice wasn't as steady as she would have liked. "How did the sheriff know where to find us?" Thompson dismounted, removing his hat as James Harlow emerged from the cabin as well. "Wasn't hard to figure. When Brannigan's men started asking specific questions about the hills west of town, I knew they were getting close. Thought you might appreciate some backup, Marshal." Ethan nodded gratefully. "Your timing was perfect, Sheriff, and the deputies." Thompson's weathered face creased in a smile. "No deputies, just my imagination and your well-placed shot. They bought it, though." "Will they really leave the area?" James asked, concern evident in his voice. "They will," Ethan confirmed. "Men like that are cowards at heart. They expected an easy target, not armed resistance. They'll report back to Brannigan that the risk isn't worth the reward." Victoria released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "So it's over." Ethan's expression softened as he looked at her. "This attempt, yes, but we still need to get you safely to Carson City for the trial. Brannigan has too much at stake to give up entirely." "The good news," Thompson interjected, "is that the circuit judge arrived in Humboldt yesterday, ahead of schedule. He's reviewed Victoria's deposition and issued warrants for Brannigan and his remaining associates. Marshals are already searching for him in Carson City and Virginia City." Hope bloomed in Victoria's chest. "So we might not need to testify after all. If they capture him before the trial, he'll still stand trial," Ethan explained. "But if he's captured with evidence of his operations, your testimony becomes supporting evidence rather than the cornerstone of the case." James laid a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "That's excellent news, Sheriff. We owe you a debt of gratitude for riding all the way up here to warn us." Thompson waved away the thanks. "Just doing my job. Besides, I've known you folks too long to let some saloon criminal threaten your family." He turned to Ethan. "What's your plan now, Marshal? Still heading to Carson City?" Ethan nodded. "Yes, but perhaps not as urgently as before. We'll stay here another day or two, then take the northern route. It's longer but less likely to be watched if Brannigan has more men in the area." As the men continued discussing logistics, Victoria found herself studying Ethan's profile. remembering their interrupted conversation from the previous night. He had been about to tell her something important, something about what happened after the trial, after Brannigan was captured. Now that the immediate danger had passed, would he return to that unfinished thought? The day passed in a strange mixture of relief and continued vigilance. Sheriff Thompson stayed for a meal before departing, promising to send word if there were any significant developments with the Brannigan case. After he left, the cabin seemed quieter, the tension of the morning giving way to a contemplative calm. As evening approached, Victoria found herself alone with Ethan on the porch while her father napped inside. They sat side by side on a rough-hewn bench, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. "Thank you," Victoria said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "for protecting us today. For everything, really." Ethan glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "You don't need to thank me, Victoria. I was doing my duty." Was it only duty? She asked, gathering her courage to address what had remained unspoken between them. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze returning to the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and sincere. "No. Not only duty. Not for some time now." Victoria's heart quickened. "Last night, before we were interrupted, you were saying something about questioning whether your life as a marshal was enough anymore. What did you mean?" He turned toward her then, his eyes reflecting the golden light of sunset. "I meant that meeting you has made me consider possibilities I'd put aside years ago. A home, a family, a life beyond the next criminal or the next town." Victoria scarcely dared to breathe. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Ethan's hand found hers on the bench between them, his touch gentle but firm. "That perhaps it's time to put down roots, if I could find someone willing to share that life with me, even though it might mean giving up being a marshal." Victoria asked, wanting to understand exactly what he was proposing. "Not necessarily giving it up entirely," Ethan clarified, "but maybe changing how I serve. The territorial governor has been offering me a position as chief marshal for the Nevada territory. It would mean being based in Carson City with less traveling and more administrative duties." He paused. "I've always turned it down before, but now." "Now you're considering it," Victoria finished for him, her heart swelling with hope. "I'm more than considering it," Ethan admitted. "I wrote to accept the position 3 days ago, while you were gathering berries with your father." His eyes searched hers. "I know this is sudden, Victoria. We've known each other only a short time, but sometimes life doesn't give us the luxury of a lengthy courtship." Victoria felt a smile breaking across her face. "Is that what this is? A courtship?" The corner of Ethan's mouth lifted in a small smile. "It is if you're amenable to the idea. I'm not offering marriage, not yet. That would indeed be too sudden. But I am asking if you might consider allowing me to call on you properly once we return to civilization, to see if what I feel for you might be something you could one day return." Victoria looked down at their joined hands, then back up to his face, this man who had saved her life, protected her family, and somehow, in the midst of danger and uncertainty, found his way into her heart. "Ethan Daniels," she said softly, "I think you know that what you feel is already returned. And yes, I would be very amenable to your calling on me. Though I warn you, Mrs. Winters will insist on chaperoning our every moment together." The smile that broke across Ethan's face transformed him, erasing years of hardship and solitude. Without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent warmth flooding through Victoria's entire being. "I think I can endure Mrs. Winters' watchful eye," he murmured as he pulled back slightly, "if it means I get to be near you." Victoria's cheeks flushed with pleasure. "My father will have questions," she warned. "He's protective." As he should be, Ethan agreed. And I intend to answer every one of those questions honestly. I respect your father, Victoria. I wouldn't proceed without his blessing. As if summoned by their discussion, the cabin door opened behind them and James Harlow stepped onto the porch. Victoria started to pull her hand from Ethan's, but he held it firmly, meeting James's questioning gaze directly. "Mr. Harlow," Ethan said, rising to his feet but keeping Victoria's hand in his, "I hope you don't find this presumptuous, but I've just asked your daughter if I might court her properly once our current situation is resolved." James looked between them, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, to Victoria's surprise, a slow smile spread across his face. "I was wondering how long it would take you to speak up, Marshal. I've seen the way you look at my daughter." Victoria felt her blush deepen. "Father," James chuckled. "What? An old man can't notice these things." "I've seen the way you look at him, too, Victoria. Neither of you is particularly subtle." Ethan cleared his throat, though Victoria could see the amusement in his eyes. "Then I take it you're not opposed to the idea, sir." James's expression grew more serious. "Victoria is old enough to make her own decisions about whom she favors, but as her father, I would be remiss if I didn't ask about your intentions and ability to provide for her." "Of course," Ethan replied respectfully. "I've recently accepted a position as Chief Marshal for the Nevada Territory, based in Carson City. It comes with a substantial salary increase and a government-provided home. My intention, if Victoria's feelings develop as I hope they might, would be marriage within a reasonable time frame." He glanced at Victoria, his eyes softening. "Though that decision would be entirely up to her." James nodded, seemingly satisfied. "And what about your tendency to find trouble or have trouble find you? Being a lawman's wife isn't easy." "The chief marshal position is largely administrative," Ethan explained. "I would still carry a badge, but my days of chasing outlaws across the territory would be over." Victoria, who had been listening to this exchange with a mixture of embarrassment and joy, finally spoke up. "Father, while I appreciate your concern, I think I'm capable of deciding whether I'm willing to accept the challenges of Ethan's profession." James laughed, holding up his hands in surrender. "Of course you are. I just wanted to hear the man say it himself." He extended his hand to Ethan. "You have my blessing, Marshal Daniels. Though I expect you to follow through on that proper courtship you mentioned, my daughter deserves no less." Ethan shook James's hand firmly. "You have my word, sir." As the three of them stood on the porch in the fading light of sunset, Victoria felt a sense of peace settle over her that had been absent since the moment of her kidnapping. The danger wasn't entirely past. Brannigan was still at large, and the journey to Carson City still lay ahead, but for the first time, she could see beyond the trial to a future that held promise and joy. Ethan's hand found hers again, squeezing gently as if he could read her thoughts. Victoria returned the pressure, her heart full as she looked out over the valley that had provided them sanctuary and unexpected love in their time of greatest need. 2 weeks later, Victoria stood on the steps of the Carson City courthouse, watching as Clayton Brannigan was led away in chains, his face twisted with impotent rage. The trial had been swift and decisive, with overwhelming evidence presented against him, including Victoria's calm, clear testimony about her kidnapping and the statements made by her captors. Ethan stood beside her, no longer in the role of protector but as her officially acknowledged suitor, his hand resting properly at the small of her back. James Harlow watched from a few steps away, pride evident in his expression. "It's really over," Victoria said softly, still hardly able to believe it. "He can't hurt anyone else now." 20 years in territorial prison, Ethan confirmed, And with the additional federal charges, he'll likely never see freedom again. The weeks since their time at the cabin had been a whirlwind. Upon arriving in Carson City, they had discovered that most of Brennigan's operation had already been dismantled by federal authorities, with several of his associates turning evidence against him in exchange for reduced sentences. Victoria's testimony had merely been the final nail in a coffin that was already firmly constructed. Ethan had immediately assumed his new position as chief marshal, moving into the modest but comfortable home provided with the role. Victoria and her father had taken rooms at the finest hotel in the city, with Ethan calling on her daily, always properly chaperoned by either James or one of the respectable matrons of Carson City society who had taken the Harlows under their wing. The courtship, though conducted under unusual circumstances, had progressed with remarkable smoothness. Victoria had discovered that the glimpses of gentleness and intelligence she had seen in Ethan at the cabin were fundamental aspects of his character, previously hidden beneath the hard exterior required by his dangerous work. As chief marshal, he was still authoritative and respected, but he seemed more at ease, more himself. For his part, Ethan had found in Victoria not just the beauty that had initially caught his attention, but a strength of character and quick mind that constantly impressed him. Their conversations ranged from literature to politics to their hopes for Nevada's future, and he never tired of her perspectives. "What happens now?" Victoria asked as they descended the courthouse steps. "Will you still need to testify at the trials of Brennigan's associates?" Ethan nodded. "For some of them, yes. But those proceedings will be scattered over the next few months, nothing that should interrupt our plans." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "Our plans? And what might those be, Chief Marshal Daniels?" A smile tugged at Ethan's lips. "Well, Miss Harlow, I was thinking it might be time to discuss with your father when we might visit the Reverend. Unless you think 2 months of courtship is still too hasty." Victoria's heart leapt. Though they had spoken often of a future together, this was the closest Ethan had come to a formal proposal. 2 months might seem hasty to some, she acknowledged, her voice carefully measured despite her inner excitement. "But considering we've faced kidnapping, gunfire, and a high-profile trial together, I'd say we've compressed quite a lot of life experience into those 2 months." Ethan's smile broadened. "My thoughts exactly. So you wouldn't be opposed to a fall wedding?" "Perhaps October, when the aspens in the hills turn golden." "October would be perfect," Victoria agreed, unable to contain her smile any longer. "Though shouldn't you be asking this question while down on one knee with a ring in hand?" Ethan chuckled, glancing around at the busy street. "I had planned something a bit more romantic than the courthouse steps after a criminal trial. Perhaps a sunset ride to a certain cabin in the mountains where I first realized I was falling in love with you." Victoria's breath caught at the word love, spoken casually yet with unmistakable sincerity. "That sounds far more appropriate," she agreed, her voice soft with emotion. James approached them then, having been engaged in conversation with the prosecutor. "Well, that's that," he declared with satisfaction. "Justice served finally. Now we can discuss our return to Humboldt." Victoria exchanged a glance with Ethan. They had yet to broach the subject of her potential permanent relocation to Carson City with her father. "Actually, Father, there's something Ethan and I would like to discuss with you over dinner tonight." James looked between them knowingly. "Let me guess you're going to tell me you've decided to marry. And you're hoping I'll give my blessing to Victoria remaining in Carson City while I return to run the store in Humboldt." Victoria blinked in surprise. "How did you, my dear girl?" James interrupted gently. "I may be getting older, but I'm not blind. I've seen how happy you are here, how well you fit into Ethan's life and he into yours." He sighed, a mix of sadness and acceptance in the sound. "The store was always meant to be yours someday, but I can't expect you to put your happiness aside for a business." "We would never ask you to run the store alone," Ethan said firmly. "In fact, I've been meaning to discuss some options with you. There's a position opening in the Territorial Commerce Office here in Carson City that would suit your experience perfectly. The pay is excellent, the hours reasonable, and you'd be working directly with the governor on regulations affecting businesses throughout Nevada." James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You've been considering my situation as well." Ethan nodded. "Victoria loves you deeply, Mr. Harlow. Your happiness is important to her, which makes it important to me. And selfishly, I'd prefer my future father-in-law close by rather than 100 miles away in Humboldt." James appeared genuinely touched by Ethan's thoughtfulness. "And the store, we could sell it," Victoria suggested tentatively. "Or perhaps hire a manager to run it while you maintain ownership. There are several options, Father. What matters is that whatever we decide as a family." The word family seemed to resonate with James. He looked between Victoria and Ethan, seeing not just his daughter and her suitor, but the beginning of a new branch of the Harlow family tree. "Well," he said finally, his voice a bit gruff with emotion, "I suppose I could at least hear more about this commerce position before making any decisions." Victoria hugged her father impulsively, relief and gratitude flooding through her. "Thank you, Father, for understanding, for supporting us, for everything." James patted her back affectionately. "You deserve happiness, my dear, and Marshal Daniels' Ethan clearly makes you happy." He stepped back, a twinkle entering his eye. "Now, I believe you two had plans for a certain mountain cabin. Perhaps this weekend would be appropriate with Mrs. Winters as chaperone, of course." Ethan nodded seriously, though Victoria could see the suppressed smile in his eyes. "Of course, sir. I wouldn't have it any other way." 3 days later, Victoria found herself once again approaching the cabin in the mountains, though under vastly different circumstances than her first visit. This time, she rode beside Ethan on her own horse, with Mrs. Winters following at a discreet distance on a gentle mare and 2 packed horses carrying supplies trailing behind. The autumn air was crisp and clear, the aspens beginning their transformation from green to gold. The valley seemed even more beautiful than Victoria remembered, peaceful in the afternoon sunlight. "It hasn't changed at all," she observed as the cabin came into view. "Some things don't need to change to become more precious," Ethan replied, his gaze on her rather than the landscape. They had maintained proper decorum throughout their courtship, with only occasional stolen kisses when chaperones momentarily looked away. But the memory of those few private moments at the cabin conversations by firelight, the first tentative acknowledgement of feelings, had sustained them through the formalities required by society. Mrs. Winters, true to form, insisted on inspecting the cabin thoroughly before allowing the young couple any privacy, even on the porch. "I promised Mr. Harlow I wouldn't let you two out of my sight," she declared, though her stern expression was belied by the twinkle in her eye. "At least not for too long." By sunset, they had settled into a comfortable routine. Mrs. Winters prepared dinner in the cabin while Ethan and Victoria sat on the porch, ostensibly within view through the window, but with just enough privacy for meaningful conversation. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Victoria asked, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of orange and gold. Ethan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I had just told you I was considering the chief marshal position, that I was thinking about putting down roots." "And now here we are," Victoria said softly, planning a life together. Ethan took her hand, his touch sending the same thrill through her that it had the first time. "There's something I need to ask you properly, Victoria. Something I've been carrying with me for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Victoria's heart quickened as Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. He slid from the bench onto one knee before her, his green eyes serious yet filled with unmistakable love. "Victoria Harlow," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his face. "When I cut those ropes from your wrists and looked into your eyes for the first time, something changed in me. I didn't recognize it then, but I know now it was the beginning of love." He opened the box, revealing a delicate gold ring set with a single perfect diamond flanked by two small emeralds. "I'm asking you to be my wife, my partner, my home. Will you marry me?" Tears of joy welled in Victoria's eyes as she looked from the ring to the man kneeling before her, this strong, honorable man who had saved her life and then, unexpectedly, captured her heart. "Yes, Ethan Daniels," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to kiss her with a tenderness that made her heart ache, Victoria knew with absolute certainty that the terrible events that had brought them together had led to something beautiful and enduring, a love that had been forged in danger but would flourish in peace. Mrs. Winters discreetly cleared her throat from the doorway, announcing that dinner was ready and gently reminding them of her presence. Victoria and Ethan separated, both smiling somewhat sheepishly, though neither could summon any real regret for the moment they had shared. As they entered the cabin, the golden light of sunset giving way to the warm glow of lamplight within, Victoria felt a profound sense of coming home, not to a place, but to a person, to a future built on mutual respect and deepening love. The autumn days passed swiftly, filled with wedding preparations and the practical arrangements of combining two lives. James Harlow accepted the position in the Commerce Office, selling the store in Humboldt to a young couple eager to establish themselves in the growing town. The Harlows relocated to Carson City permanently, with James taking rooms near the government offices while Victoria remained at the hotel until the wedding. Ethan's home, a handsome two-story structure provided by the territorial government, underwent a transformation under Victoria's careful direction. New curtains, rugs, and furniture turned the previously Spartan bachelor's quarters into a warm, inviting family home. Ethan watched these changes with amused tolerance, happy to see Victoria making the space her own. On a perfect October afternoon, with the mountains aflame in autumn colors, Victoria Harlow became Victoria Daniels in a ceremony attended by the most prominent citizens of Carson City, including the governor himself. Sheriff Thompson traveled from Humboldt for the occasion, along with many of the townspeople who had known Victoria since childhood. As they exchanged vows in the white steepled church at the center of town, Ethan's voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving Victoria's face. When he promised to love, honor, and protect her all the days of his life, those who knew their story recognized it was not an empty vow, but one he had already proven he would keep. The reception that followed at the governor's mansion was elegant yet warmly informal, with Victoria and Ethan moving among their guests hand in hand, their happiness evident to all who saw them. Even Clayton Jeffries, who had traveled from Humboldt ostensibly to support the Harlows but perhaps more to satisfy his curiosity about the man who had won Victoria's heart, was forced to acknowledge the genuine affection between the couple. "You look radiant, Mrs. Daniels," he said to Victoria when propriety demanded he offer his congratulations. "The Chief Marshal is a fortunate man." "I'm the fortunate one, Mr. Jeffries," Victoria replied graciously, though her eyes immediately sought Ethan across the room, as if even a brief separation was too long. "But thank you for your kind words." As evening approached, the newlyweds slipped away to begin their wedding journey, not to San Francisco or the East as many had expected, but to a certain cabin in the mountains that held special significance for them both. This time, however, there would be no chaperone, no immediate danger, no uncertainty about their feelings or future. The cabin had been prepared for their arrival, with fresh linens, flowers, and supplies enough for a week of seclusion. A bottle of fine champagne waited on the table, a wedding gift from the governor, along with a note excusing Chief Marshal Daniels from his duties for a full fortnight. As Ethan lifted Victoria across the threshold of the cabin, now legally and morally theirs, to share completely, she was struck by how differently she viewed the space that had once been a place of refuge in danger. Now it was a sanctuary of another kind, the place where their life together would truly begin. "Welcome home, Mrs. Daniels," Ethan said softly, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Victoria looked up at her husband, with love that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. "It feels right, doesn't it? Being here together where everything really began." Ethan nodded, his expression tender as he reached up to trace the curve of her cheek. "Full circle, from fear to safety, from danger to peace. From strangers to husband and wife," Victoria added, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his, no longer concerned with propriety or chaperones or anything but the love they shared. Later, as they lay together in the soft darkness of the bedroom, Victoria rested her head on Ethan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been unexpected and fraught with peril, yet she wouldn't have changed a single step if it meant not finding her way to him. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked quietly, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Victoria smiled in the darkness. "I was thinking about fate, actually, how the worst day of my life led to the best days of my life." Ethan's arms tightened around her. "I've thought the same. If those men hadn't taken you, if I hadn't been tracking them already, we might never have met," Victoria finished. "Or we might have passed each other on the street in Humboldt without a second glance." "I doubt that very much," Ethan said with quiet certainty. "Some things are meant to be, Victoria. I believe I would have found you one way or another." Victoria raised herself on one elbow to look down at him, his features visible in the moonlight streaming through the window. "Is that what you believe? That we were destined for each other?" Ethan considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I believe we make our own choices, forge our own paths, but I also believe that sometimes those paths are meant to converge. When I saw you that day, something in me recognized something in you, like a missing piece falling into place." The poetry of his words touched Victoria deeply. This was the private Ethan, the man beneath the marshal's stern exterior, the man only she was privileged to know completely. "I felt it too," she admitted. "Even then, frightened and disoriented as I was, I knew you were different from any man I'd ever met." Ethan drew her down for a kiss that conveyed all the emotion words couldn't express. When they finally parted, he whispered against her lips, "I love you, Victoria Daniels, now and always." "And I love you," she replied, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain such happiness. Now and always. In the years that followed, the story of Marshal Daniels and Victoria Harlow became something of a legend in Nevada territory, how he had rescued her from kidnappers, protected her from a powerful criminal's vengeance, and ultimately won her heart. Their cabin in the mountains remained their special retreat, a place they returned to often as their family grew and life's responsibilities multiplied. Ethan served with distinction as chief marshal until Nevada achieved statehood, at which point he was appointed to the state Supreme Court, his unwavering commitment to justice finally finding expression in a role that didn't require him to wear a gun. Victoria, meanwhile, established a school for young women in Carson City, teaching them not just the traditional feminine arts, but also practical skills like bookkeeping and self-defense that would serve them well on the frontier. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, all of whom grew up hearing the story of how their parents met, though the more frightening aspects were softened until they were old enough to understand. The oldest son eventually followed his father into law, while the younger became a doctor. Their daughter, with her mother's spirit and her father's sense of justice, became one of Nevada's first female attorneys. James Harlow lived to see all 3 of his grandchildren grown, his later years filled with the joy of family and the satisfaction of contributing to Nevada's development through his work in the Commerce Office. He never remarried, but neither did he seem lonely, finding purpose in his work and contentment in the family that surrounded him. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Ethan took Victoria back to the cabin for a special celebration. Though they visited often, this time was different, a milestone that deserved recognition in the place where their story had begun. As they sat on the porch watching a sunset remarkably similar to the one they had shared on the day he proposed, Victoria leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, comfortable in the silence that comes from years of shared experience. 25 years, she mused finally. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you cut those ropes and saved me. Other times it feels like we've always been together. Ethan's arm tightened around her shoulders, his touch as reassuring now as it had been on that first terrifying day. Best decision I ever made, following those tracks to that wagon. He pressed a kiss to her temple, still silver-free despite the passage of years. Though I think my second best decision was asking you to marry me. Victoria laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as it had been in her youth. And to think, all it took was a kidnapping, a shootout, and a high-profile criminal trial to bring us together. Most couples have to make do with a dance at a social. Ethan chuckled, the rumble in his chest familiar and comforting against her side. We never did do things the easy way, did we? No, Victoria agreed, lifting her face for his kiss. But I wouldn't change a single moment. As the sun dipped below the western mountains, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and gold, Victoria Daniels reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment, from a terrified captive to a beloved wife, mother, and respected member of her community. The path had not always been easy, but it had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man who had not only saved her life, but had given her a life worth living. And in the end, that was a love story worth telling.